This spring, I was riding the subway late at night. The carriage was half empty, although all the seats were occupied. At one of the stations, a very unkempt-looking elderly woman who looked like a drunken hobo entered my car. She stood right in front of me, clearly forcing me to give her a seat. If it had been a normal old lady in her place, I would have stood up, of course, but I didn't want to give way to this fat, dirty, burgundy-faced, drunken homeless woman. I took out a notebook with notes and ducked into it. Every time the train braked, this lady fell on me. I went through a couple of stations like that. I got tired of it all and I was about to get up, but the woman at the next braking of the train piled on top of me and hissed right into my ear. "You'll remember me again. Wait for Friday." The train stopped and she stepped out onto the platform, and I was left with a kind of oppressive feeling in my soul and a needle in my heart. Of course, I began to reassure myself internally that nothing terrible had happened, that it was just an angry, drunken grandmother. A few days later, I woke up in the morning and found that my pillow was covered in blood. At night, apparently, there was a nosebleed. I didn't pay much attention to it that time. A week later, I woke up again. My pillow was covered in blood. So continued every week. My parents forced me to undergo a full examination. All the tests showed that I'm fine, but my nose keeps bleeding, exactly on Thursday and Friday night, and after that, I've been a wreck all day Friday. Things aren't going well, my mood is terrible, and I've been waking up at night with a jolt, more like a blow to the head, and the smell in the room is like that homeless woman from the car, and I hear whispers, coughs, and heavy footsteps. For 6 months now, I've tried not to plan any errands on Fridays, and I walk with caution on that day. My friends persuade me to go to a psychic, maybe a curse, that ugly old woman put a curse on me, but I still refuse. I go slowly to church, read prayers. At home I light a lamp with an incense. And now I think that no matter how disgusting a person may seem to you, it is better to stay away from him. When I was a student, I worked part-time as a trackman in the subway at night, but I didn't stay there for very long. Strange stories happened to me during that year, but I'll tell you the one after which I quit immediately. In general, the work is not so difficult. After closing the subway for passengers, it continues to boil almost the same life. A lot of different services work: cleaners, technicians, electricians, bypassers. A lot of people, in short. And the task of a bypasser is to wander from one line to another and check for track malfunctions and other breakdowns. I went out for my shift. Everything's on schedule. Checked the flashlight. Checked the radio. I had a little laugh with the men, had a smoke, and started to leave. I passed the first run quickly. I was thinking about something of my own. I don't even remember. The second one was fast too. I remember whistling something. They were short distances. I passed them in an hour or so. There was still one more up ahead, more authentic. It was the 49th Street station. I passed it, went into the tunnel, and literally 100 meters before I got there, the light from the station was still falling. I heard footsteps behind me. My heart clenched. I quickly turned around. I look. A figure from the station is walking towards me. I got a little scared. I shined my flashlight at her and yelled, "Who are you?" And I thought, maybe the janitor wants something, a cigarette, for example. After a couple of steps, almost as soon as I shone the light, I recognized the figure. It was Alain, a normal guy from the other shift. Cheerful, joking all the time. We even had a couple of beers with him in the locker room after the shift, but in principle, I didn't talk to him that much. "Alain, are you there?" I shout to him, and he comes up to me and says, "Hello." Alain looked like Alain, but he was pale. I noticed that right away, and I said, "You look a little pale, Alain," to which he mumbled something about having had too much to drink the night before. So I asked him what he was doing here. He said that he'd just had one tunnel today. He'd already gone through it, and that there was some kind of breakdown on 50th Street, and that the men were working there, so he decided to help me, and then he saw me coming from the platform and decided that we'd go together. That's about it. That's all I remember from the specific conversation. Then we mostly went on in silence. Well, maybe a person really has a headache after yesterday, for example. No mood to communicate or something else, I thought then. Nothing strange. The only thing I remembered well was that Alain complained a couple of times that he was cold. In principle, it was always not hot in the subway, but for some reason, I remembered these words well. We got to 50th Street. Alain said he would go into the back room there for some reason. We said goodbye and went our separate ways. The time was already at the end of the shift. In half an hour they would energize the contact rail. I did my job, reported to the dispatcher that there were no accidents and everything was in order, washed up and left with a calm soul. Everything seemed to be normal. The next night I came to the shift again. My friend asked me to fill in, and it was just the shift where Alain worked. And in the locker room, Joe asks me in passing if I remember Alain. I said I remembered, of course, and he says to me, "He died the day before yesterday, the funeral's tomorrow." I got upset, I felt sorry for the guy, so I asked him what happened, and Joe said he had a heart attack. The neighbor found him at home this morning, and then I got an electric shock. "When did you say he died?" "Day before yesterday," I asked. "Yeah," Joe said. I asked again and said I'd been walking through the tunnel with him only last night. Joe said it couldn't be, and that I was drunk. Some other guys came in and asked if we'd heard about Alain. "When did he die?" I almost shouted. "Tuesday, the day before yesterday." I sat down. I vaguely remember the rest. The men asked me something and looked at me warily. I guess I looked like shit. Someone, I think, asked if everything was normal and what had happened. Anyway, I ran to the shift supervisor yelling at him to give me a form and that I wouldn't go into the tunnels again. He yelled for me to go home and sleep it off. Then all of a sudden we both stopped talking, and the shift supervisor asked me what happened. I looked at him seriously and I just said, "I saw him yesterday. I walked with him all the way to 50th Street. The chief looked at me strangely and without saying a word, took my statement written with a shaky hand and said that I could leave. In general, I was scared half to death and drank for a week after that. I didn't go to Elena's funeral. I was scared to death. I went down to the subway. It was about 11 o'clock. As usual on Friday, there was a lot to do at work, so I was getting home so late. Very tired, I entered the last carriage. Not paying attention to anyone, I sat down on an empty seat, turned my headphones almost to full volume and closed my eyes. I had one line to go to the end. Apparently I dozed off and I woke up to silence. You know, when the train stops, suddenly there's this unusual silence in the car. I opened my eyes and looked around. Shit, I thought. I can't believe they're taking me to the depot. There was only me in the wagon. But then I looked in the other car and calmed down. There was a group of people sitting there, discussing something and singing songs. The train accelerated its usual speed and I finally calmed down. But then a song went by, followed by another. I knew we had a long transfer between stations on the line, but it was only 2 and a bit minutes. Both songs lasted at least 3 minutes, and the train kept going at the same speed. I went to the glass between the cars and looked at the company from the front car, but they seemed quiet. Something about them struck me as odd. There were 3 of them, 2 girls and a guy. One of the girls sat with her back to me, turning her back to the others. Suddenly I realized what confused me. This girl sitting back was moving her hand too rhythmically. Every 15 seconds she would raise and twist her hand, explaining something and lower it again, like a wound-up machine, with the precision of a second. Then I noticed the same pattern in the guy. He was nodding his head at the same intervals, I tapped them, but they were doing the same thing at regular intervals. "I like trains," I heard behind me. A chill ran through me, and I overpowered myself and turned around. By one of the doors stood a boy, about 6 years old, looking out the window. "Who are you?" I barely squeezed out, being absolutely sure that a minute ago there had been no one in the carriage. "Martin," he introduced himself seriously, looking at me with green eyes. Then he turned to the window and stared at me, mesmerized. "Why are you alone? Where are your parents?" I asked him a question. "My parents left without me," he sighed. "My mom cried, but they couldn't take me away, probably because I died." He sighed once more. I didn't have time to realize what he had said before the boy continued. "The station is soon, and I'll ride some more." He looked at me and smiled. I really loved riding the subway and the train to my grandmother. Suddenly I woke up sitting in a crowded train car. I stood up, giving way to some lady, and all the way home I stood looking around at the people crowded around me. When I got home, I poured myself some hot tea and surfed the internet. I spent over an hour typing in queries on station names, distances, nearby stations, until finally, on one of the news feeds, I found a mention of a boy dying in a subway carriage on the line between stations. And on the side of the article was a picture of the boy. Yes, Martin was looking at me from the monitor screen. Since then, I can't sleep on the subway, and when passing through the passage between these stations, I always remember the boy with green eyes who loved to ride on trains.